Hey there, it's Dr. Bernstein, and in this video I'm just going to talk to you about a few things related to the open boat. If you've started reading it, you are already probably noticing that we're leaving the happy, funny world of Billy Collins and entering into a story that's a little bit darker and bleaker, at least in the beginning, although there's definitely some humor in the story. And Collins was talking about water skiing on the surface of a poem, enjoying the surface, and also getting into the room of the poem, feeling your way around. And this is a story about four men who are stranded on the ocean, and so there's a lot of activity that's happening on the surface of the ocean, but this is actually a very deep story, and you sort of those surface details are conveying a deeper underlying message that's part of the theme of this work. So I just want to go over a couple of points related to the story and to get you sort of understanding some things that are taking place. So right at the very beginning of the story, we have these lines. None of them knew the color of the sky. Their eyes glanced level and were fastened upon the waves that swept toward them. These waves were of the hue of slate, save for the tops, which were a foaming white, and all of the men knew the colors of the sea. The horizon narrowed and widened and dipped and rose, and at all times its edge was jagged with waves that seemed thrust up in points like rocks. So, um, what you can tell right from this opening paragraph is that this story is being told from the limited, omniscient point of view. So some stories are told from an omniscient and all-knowing point of view, where the narrator would sort of give you a sense of, well, the men might not know what the color of the sky was, but we know that on this day that seemed so grim to them, it was actually a gorgeous day. And so that type of narration makes us feel that we know, we're in a position of knowing and understanding the context of what's going on. Crane, on the other hand, gives us a limited omniscient point of view. So the narrator tells us that none of the men knew this, but is not telling us what the sky was like. So our knowledge is limited, as is the point of view of the narrator. So we're sort of thrust into the situation with the men, and we don't really know what's going to happen. So you'll notice that's what's going on here, and immediately we see these descriptions of nature, of the sea, of the ocean, of the waves being jagged, of seeming like they're thrust up in points like rocks. In the next paragraph, there's the line, these waves were most wrongfully and barbarously abrupt and tall. Skip over to the next page, and you get the line, a singular disadvantage of the sea lies in the fact that after successfully surmounting one wave, you discover that there is another behind it, just as important and just as nervously anxious to do something effective in the way of swamping boats. So there, through his diction, through his choice of words, Crane, in describing nature, Crane is giving us, is revealing something about the story and the men's perspective on it. So nature seems really sort of out to get them, seems wrongful, barbaric, that it's there, the waves are given intention. They seem nervously anxious to harm and swamp the boats. So, in a way, what's happening here is he's personifying nature. Nature is taking on human-like characteristics. At least that's how it seems to the men. So this is very important. You should think about what happens to the men's understanding of nature over the course of a story. Does it change? Because right now we're starting to get a sense of what makes the story a naturalistic story, and that is the naturalists believe that the environment or our heredity had control over us. So in this situation, we could determine our fates. So in this part of the story, we're starting to see that nature that's the environment, seems to have control over the fate of the men. And just in a couple of lines, we're getting there's so much going on in the story. Um, as I've pointed out for the discussion posts, I want you to think about why it is that Crane, why you think it is, okay? I really want to hear what you think, what your interpretation of this is. But why you think he chose not to give us the proper names of his characters? Why just call them by their occupations? What is the significance of that? How do you think that might relate to the story as a whole? Let me just point out on the second, it's the second page, and in the original text it's 729, there's the paragraph that begins, "In the wan light, the faces of the men must have been gray. Their eyes must have glinted in strange ways as they gazed steadily astern. Viewed from a balcony, the whole thing would doubtlessly have been weirdly picturesque, but the men in the boat had no time to see it, and if they had had leisure, there were other things to occupy their minds." So here, what we're getting is a little bit of a break in the limited omniscient point of view. He's not going into omniscient because he's saying their eyes must have been like this, but we don't know for sure. But what we're getting here is that if you're in the situation, when you're in the moment going through an experience, you have a very different perspective than someone who is looking at it from the outside. Or if you've gone through an experience, once you go through it, you look back on it and say, oh, wow, like I never would have seen that in the moment. And that's what he's describing here. If you were looking down on this situation from a balcony or looking out at it from a balcony, it would seem very different from the way it feels for the men. And I bring this up because I think this story, there's a lot of stuff in the story about interpretation. And when can you finally interpret something and understand its meaning? So you can sort of see that that's a connection between with the Spiro Wagner and the Collins poems. It's like, when are you ready to interpret something, and how do you go about doing that? That's what's going on with these men. They're trying to make sense of their situation. And you'll notice, that's all I'm going to say about it for now, but you'll see that that repetition that Crane uses of saying, if I'm going to be drowned, if I'm going to be drowned, they're trying to make sense of the situation that's so terrible and unthinkable to them. Just like when something terrible happens in the world, like on 9/11 or after the tsunami, you keep seeing the images over and over again because that repetition is a way of processing and making sense of what you've experienced. I'm losing my point a little bit here. But there's this issue of interpretation. The men are arguing with each other about, what does this mean? What does that mean? Is it this or is it that? Why don't people understand us? And then, all the way at the very end of the story, the very last line is that, let me get it. When it came night, the white waves paced to and fro in the moonlight, and the wind brought the sound of the great sea's voice to the men on the shore, and they felt that they could then be interpreters. So, all the way to the last line, the last word of the story suggests that this is a story that is somehow about interpretation. In fact, at one point in the story, there's a reference to a poem that the correspondent had been forced to read as a child, and now he knows how to understand it, to interpret it. So I hope this little overview has helped give you some perspective on the story and got some questions generated in your mind so that you can go back and either reread what you've read and think about the text from this perspective, or think about, as you're reading, think about these issues and what your responses are to them. So that's it for now. Bye.